Okay, so welcome everybody to our training on working with interpreters. We are so glad to have Drew Barr back with us. Drew is an experienced interpreter and lawyer and also trainer of interpreters, and in fact was with NYLAG a year ago meeting with our paralegal interpreters to talk about best practices for interpreting. And at that time, what we realized is that he has a lot of wisdom, but that this wisdom also needs to be shared with those of us who use interpreters and who work with interpreters, because those best practices have to be practiced on all sides of the triangle, shall we say. So we have Drew back, and I'm going to hand it over to him. And we have, that was my timer to tell me, please record. And we also have a panel of expert paralegals from NYLAG who are going to help us today. And that is Rogelio Tech from True. We have Shelley Pyers from True. We have Maria Huel from IPU, and we have Denise Bravo from DVLU. Thanks to all of you guys for joining us and sharing your advice and wisdom in advance. And I'll hand it over to Drew.
Thank you so much, Maya. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys, even though it's via Zoom. I'm based in Northern Virginia, close to DC, so we're in the same time zone, thankfully, but I do kind of wish I could be up there visiting with you guys, and who knows, maybe I'll make a trip up sometime in the future. As Maya said, I have a kind of unique experience that I can bring to this court, or to this class. I mean, I was an interpreter for about 4 or 5 years, including in some court settings and also with large DC law firms, some nonprofits, some jail visits, different settings across the legal interpreting spectrum. Then I became an attorney. I'm currently a solo immigration attorney, and I teach these classes on the side to kind of give myself a break from my day job. And what I found is that one of my favorite parts about being a former interpreter is being able to teach interpreting classes. So I teach interpreting classes a few times a year. This is my first time, however, teaching attorneys about working with interpreters. So what I've tried to do in this course is divide it up into 3 sections. In the first section, I'm going to be giving you guys what I think is the most relevant information that you will need to know for working well with interpreters. In the second section, we're going to take that knowledge that we got and put it into practice through a couple of scripts. And then at the end, we're going to hear directly from our paralegal interpreters at NYLAG, who are going to be in a panel talking to us about what their experiences have been dealing with their dual role as paralegals and interpreters. And hopefully they'll be able to share some wisdom with us about what it's like working with attorneys at NYLAG and good practices that they've seen and how they would like things to improve. So my goal in teaching this class is to help everybody have an easier time working with the paralegal interpreters at NYLAG and to kind of understand a bit better and empathize better with the things that the paralegal interpreters do for many, many reasons that we'll see in this course, why it is that interpreters sometimes behave a little bit different than you might expect them to. And as we go through this, I want everybody to feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to be relying on Maya to help me facilitate discussion, but I don't mind at all being interrupted, being a court interpreter especially, and, being a lawyer who goes to court got me used to being interrupted all the time by judges and attorneys. And so I never, ever want you to feel like you can't speak up or can't interrupt to ask a question. I will try and finish my sentence before I give it over to you, but I do really appreciate your discussion because the goal again for the class today is to make sure that everybody has a better experience working with interpreters and that we can do so more effectively. So we're not just seeking to learn some knowledge, except that instead we're looking to put it into practice. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. All right, so the first thing I'd like to say real quick is that when we're going over these concepts, some of the slides that I've given for us today to go through are directed towards interpreters. I've tried to edit the slides, but if I have any typos or errors that say the interpreter should or the attorney should, just bear with me and I'll make sure that I address those as we go through the slides. So I have here to start us off a quick video about interpreting gone wrong. I think this is called The World's Worst Translator. And it's a YouTube video that I often used on my class to kind of illustrate how necessary an interpreter is and how necessary their assistance is when working with two people who speak different languages. And what I'd like everybody to look at here in this video as you're working with it is to try and relate to how is each person feeling and what assumptions is each person making that turns out to be incorrect. This is a quick video. Again, this is not best practice, it's the exact opposite. But as you're looking at the video and thinking about that, we'll try and get back to you here for some comments. Here we go.
Muy grande. Yo nunca he hecho esto antes, ¿verdad? Pero hermano, simplemente traduce exactamente lo que dice. Exactamente lo que dice. Ok. El jefe evoluciona. ¿Cómo me dijiste? El jefe. Got the money. Got the weapons. You want to talk to him? You talk to me. Are you the translator? Ah, tú eres el traductor. No, tú eres el traductor. No, you are the translator. Okay. I got the money. Y yo tengo. Hey, perdón. No te escuché tosiste. I didn't hear you coughed. No, I didn't. I didn't cough. You coughed. No, yo no tosí, tú tosiste. Deja de decir que yo tosí. Stop saying that I coughed. You coughed when you spoke to el jefe. Tú tosiste cuando hablaste con el jefe. ¿De qué estás hablando, traductor? Ah, translator, what are you talking about? Can I try talking to him alone? ¿Puedo hablar con él a solas? Sí, yo me voy. Yes, I will go. What? No. No. Hey, I meant us. Ah, ¿se refiere a nosotros? Sí, ven acá. Yes, come here. Mira, pensé que querías hablar conmigo solo. Wait, I thought you wanted to talk to me alone. Yeah, exactly. Sí, exactamente. Entonces ven acá. Then come here. Look. Um, do you have how do you say las armas? Mira, tú tienes las ¿cómo se dice? The weapons. ¿Qué es weapon? What is las armas? Weapons. Las armas. Armas, weapons. Sí, las armas, pero ¿qué es weapon? Yes, weapons, but what is las armas? You are the worst translator. Tú eres el peor traductor. Tú, ¿verdad que yo no soy traductor? No. You, I'm not a translator. Not him. You. Él no dice que me joda a mí, que te jodas tú. Jefe, jefe, yo no tuve nada que, es culpa de completamente. Okay? Wait, hey. No, I'm on your side. Relax, okay? Jefe, mata al americano. Whoa. You telling him to kill me? No, mata al americano ese güey. Ese Guatemala no es, okay? Con la pistola, bang, ahora, bang. See, it does sound like you're telling him to shoot me. No, that's how you hook it. That's how, bang. Ahora, en la cabeza, dale. Okay, he shoots me, I shoot you. Él me dispara, yo te disparo. Espera, ¿te refieres a ti o él? Wait, do you mean you or him? You! Mío. Lo siento, es el peor traductor. Sorry. He's forced. Translator.
All right. You know, I've seen that video probably a dozen times, but it still makes me laugh, especially when the interpreter interprets the pigeons coo into English and Spanish. That's the part that really gets me. So let's get some comments here from everybody. What do you think was the confusion that happened in different parts of this video, and how is that making people feel? You can include the interpreter if you want, but let's focus to start off on each of the dealers, the jefe and the American, we'll call them. You can feel free to either raise your hand via the signal or just unmute yourself if you'd like to speak. Okay, well, I will get us warmed up. Did we have somebody? I heard something. I'll get us warmed up. I think one of the most frustrating things that can happen in a situation like this is when it's not clear who the message is intended for. There's a lot of parts in this video where we're not quite sure, or at least it might seem sure to us, but to the people in the video, it's definitely not clear who is speaking to who, or who are they speaking for. For example, are they addressing the interpreter or are they addressing the other side? What did you guys think about that particular point of confusion? It's a Friday, you guys. Maybe we need to take a coffee break.
Come on, folks. Let's join in.
I find myself thinking that if at any point they had just taken a break to sort of clarify or infer, just sort of not really focus on speaking directly to the interpreter and just keep saying what it is that they wanted to say, that could have potentially helped.
Yes, definitely, definitely. And even something as small as saying to the interpreter, "Oh, bless you," has caused confusion in a situation like this. And I won't pretend like it's not the interpreter's fault in this particular video, right? This is a video, it's meant for comedic effect. Obviously, everything's exaggerated. But even something as small as that can create confusion. And I think that having spoken with a lot of NYLAG interpreters, some comments that were made were that, yes, there are frustrating experiences in being an interpreter, even working with people who work with paralegal interpreters all the time. And so our goal today is to get into some of those points of confusion, some of those points of frustration. All right, let's see if people bite on this one a little bit more. Is anybody here an expert or feel that they are well versed in idioms? Does anybody here feel like English idioms are really their thing? Okay, let's see if can we get one of Jack Wisniewski. It looks like you're giving a thumbs up. Do you feel like you're pretty well versed in English idioms?
Yeah, I think the cliches and the idioms are always they're pretty funny, and it's especially when you compare them to other languages like Spanish, how that changes.
Exactly. And I'm glad that you mentioned that part too, because idioms are infamous in interpreting as being difficult to interpret. You basically have to take the saying, go to the literal meaning, and then convert that literal meaning into the other language. Jack, would you like to take a stab at a few of these and just explain what the idiom means, but literally and in as few words as possible? Let's see how well you do.
So, sorry, just to clarify, you're asking if for me to like pick a couple from the list and just be like, this is the meaning of it.
Yes, and the challenge is, can you say the meaning of the idiom in, let's say, half a dozen words or less?
Okay, so break a leg would be good luck.
Great.
Um, cutting corners. I was gonna say take the easy way out. It's kind of another idiom in itself.
It is, yes.
Efficiency, yeah. Bite the bullet. Yeah, that's tough. I mean, 6 words.
I'm on this call about interpreters.
Somebody's on a call about interpreters, but Jack, I
Yeah.
appreciate you. Thank you very much. So it's very difficult to do what an interpreter does with idioms because what you're essentially doing is to make it not be very obvious that you're adding more words to explain a meaning. You can't add too many words to what you interpret. Otherwise, people will think that you're adding or taking away, and it looks suspicious to somebody who's not an interpreter and not bilingual. And so, yeah, we all know what these idioms mean, or most of us know what most of the idioms mean. And you know, Jack, I didn't realize break a leg could just be good luck. So props to you for that one. But for many of these, interpreting it in just a few words is difficult. And so the idea here is for everybody to keep in mind that interpreting, yeah, at one point it does look like just repeating what somebody else is saying, but it's also a lot more than that. And it is a skill that people spend their whole careers developing as well. One of the things that I wanted to bring up to everybody here in the class today on working with interpreters specifically at NYLAG is this concept that I went over with the interpreters last year that's known as first person. And this is one of the first things that's taught in any interpreting course for professional interpreters. First person means that the interpreter is going to convert the exact meaning of what is said into the other language. So that means they're going to use the same pronouns. And when I say the same pronouns, I don't mean that we're affirming somebody's gender. In this case, I mean that if the speaker says you, that the interpreter says you. If the speaker says he, the interpreter says he. If the speaker says I, the interpreter says I. Now, this can, for somebody who's not used to working with interpreters, be something that feels a little bit awkward. For example, if you say, oh, I'm very sorry that I didn't pay you yesterday, and the interpreter says in, say, Spanish or another language, I'm very sorry I didn't pay you yesterday. Somebody who's not used to working with interpreters might think, well, the interpreter didn't pay me. And that's kind of what we saw in this world's worst translator video, right? And so the reason that we use first person, despite that potential confusion, is that first, it's quite a lot of work, actually, although it may not appear so at first brush or first glance, that converting those pronouns from he to she to I, or would you please ask, or please tell him this or the other, would add a lot of work for the interpreter, but in fact it does. And in fact, it introduces a lot of potential for making mistakes and errors. And the second thing is that it's just more efficient. Every time you speak to someone, imagine adding 3 or 4 words to your sentence, and that quickly bogs down the conversation. So whenever you're having a conversation with your client as an attorney or a staff member at NYLAG, and you have to preface each thing that you want to say with, would you please ask him, or please tell him, then you are really adding a lot to the conversation, perhaps even multiplying the length of the conversation when you consider that the interpreter still has to interpret everything that you say. So here's just a quick English-Spanish example of first person. If somebody were to say, me llamo Adrián, and then I would say, my name is Adrian. If someone were to say, nice to meet you, then I would say, encantada de conocerla. Something here that I think is in the slides that I normally tell interpreters, but it might just be a nice fact for you all to know, is that the interpreter is going to copy your gender preference, is going to copy other things as if they were literally you speaking. So keep that in mind, that if there is ever a confusion, which hopefully there won't be, that the interpreter is speaking as if they were you, including using your gender for words and languages that have genders. Now, one thing that I haven't covered yet, but that we're going to be focusing on a bit in the next few minutes, is something called the primary relationship. I don't need to preach to the choir and tell all of you that having a good relationship of trust with your clients is important. I know that you all know that. But what I will say is that first-person speech reinforces that primary relationship. The relationship that a LEP, which is a limited English proficient person, the jargon that we use in interpreting, has with their interpreter can often overshadow the relationship that they have with their attorney. And that is because the attorney and the interpreter might share a lot of things in common that they don't necessarily share with the attorney. For example, an interpreter may have a similar background or history, having been born in the same country or similar culture as the LEP person, the limited English proficient client. They may also look similar, or may perhaps be closer in age, closer in economic background, perhaps even closer in education. And that, besides having a linguistic connection, means that one of the challenges in using interpreters and paralegal interpreters in this case appropriately, and using them to the fullest advantage that we have as attorneys and staff members, is to make sure that instead of focusing the attention between the client and the interpreter, that we're focusing the relationship on the client and ourselves. And so first person speech helps us to do that, because the interpreter is speaking as if they were us, the attorney, and as if they were the client. And that helps us to imagine that the interpreter is not actually there. And that is in fact the goal of a good interpreter, is to make their presence not felt. In other words, they want to be unobtrusive. They want to be in the background. They want to be hidden. One of the best compliments an interpreter can get is always, "Oh, I forgot you were there," or "It felt like I was speaking with them," or "like we were speaking in the same language." And that is one of the great goals of interpreting, is to bridge that gap between languages so that you feel like you really are having a direct conversation. First person speech, which is again just using those same pronouns, also helps the interpreter to not be the focus of attention, and helps them focus on repeating exactly what was said. Because in legal settings like at NYLAG, with all the different units that we have, it's very important that the message is exactly right. We don't want our paralegal interpreters, even though they're very talented, very capable, and often just as knowledgeable as the attorneys on staff, we don't want them trying to define words on the fly in a different language. We don't want them trying to guess the meaning of things. And so using that first person speech and having the interpreter focus on exactly what is said should be our goal at all times. Are there any questions? I know we don't have a particularly lively group so far, but if anybody has a question that they would like to ask before we move on from first person speech, feel free.
Hey, I had a quick question, but you might be planning to cover it in the future.
Oh, go ahead anyways.
So I was wondering, should you be, when you're speaking through an interpreter, should you be looking at the client, or is it impolite to sort of not be looking at the interpreter in that way when you're speaking to them?
That's a great question, and I do have it in the slides, but let me quickly address it now. The idea is that if you're meeting in person, that the interpreter is going to be positioning themselves in a way that's visible to you, the attorney, but not necessarily to the client. And that is because in interpreting courses, interpreters are taught that it's much easier for the attorney, who's a professional and who's responsible ethically for what goes on in the meeting, for them to focus on the client than it is for the client, who may be new to the setting, new to this type of activity, to ignore the interpreter. So yes, you should focus on the client and not the interpreter. In fact, I used to like it a lot when I was an interpreter, when nobody was looking at me at all, because that allowed me to just focus on doing my job. We'll get more into how interpreters position themselves though in just a minute. For now, thank you so much for the question.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions on this particular topic, first person? Okay, well, we'll keep going, but as a reminder, I do not mind at all being interrupted, so feel free to speak up. All right, so the next concept that we're going to cover is that when you're working with an interpreter, one of the requests that interpreters get, not necessarily at NYLAG, but in general, is why they have to wait and pause before the interpreter interprets. A lot of people are familiar with having seen either the United Nations proceedings or just large conferences, that there exists something called simultaneous interpretation. And there's a very good reason why interpreters don't use those headphones and simultaneous interpretation for regular attorney-client meetings. The reason is several. It's that, first of all, using pause interpreting, which is also known as consecutive interpreting, tends to be more accurate for many interpreters. It doesn't have the load of hearing and speaking at the same time, that mental load. And also because it seems to be less confusing for people who are not used to working with interpreters. And while many of us, many of you, I should say, as attorneys and staff at NYLAG are used to working with your paralegal interpreters, surprisingly, many clients, these limited English proficient persons, do not have a lot of experience working with interpreters, or at least not with professional interpreters. Many people tell me, my clients tell me that, they might have a family member who can help them a little bit, but that feels very different than having an interpreter that you don't know who's doing a more professional interpretation. So when we use consecutive mode, again, this is pause interpreting, the thing that we're used to, where you say a line or two, then you wait for the interpreter, then the other person speaks, or you speak again, then you wait, and then you take turns. And this one is usually just a few words to a few sentences at a time. And this is another point that I want, if you only take a few points away from this presentation, for people to remember, is that the interpreter is hearing the message, remembering the message, converting the message to another language, and then speaking that message. And so when you give a larger amount of meaning, of segment of speech, you are really making the interpreter's job a lot harder to do accurately. So you shouldn't be afraid at all to pause often, potentially every sentence or two. Or a rule that I like to give is every time that you feel tempted to pause for breath. And when you're delivering your message, you can always feel free to make a gesture, maybe just kind of like a wait gesture, or you can use the tone of your voice or the place where you stop in your communication to indicate that you're going to keep on speaking after the interpreter interprets what you say. It's a fear that a lot of people have working with interpreters. But as you get more comfortable working with paralegal interpreters, and as paralegal interpreters get more training at NYLAG, the conversation actually flows very well, even if you need to break up a long explanation into several parts. So it's not necessarily a sentence structure, or I should say a conversation structure, where you say something, then they say something, and you say something, then they say something. You can pause and then keep speaking, and that will allow the interpreter to do a better job while not limiting the amount of what you're able to say. Now, consecutive interpreting is the default mode in most community interpreting, not just legal interpreting. So this includes, many, many types of settings with therapists, with community engagement, with schools. And what interpreters are taught is that they should always stay in consecutive mode for these types of settings unless there's a need to switch. So if anybody is wondering, is there absolutely zero circumstances where you wouldn't use this type of interpreting? Yeah, there's exceptions. But what I want everyone to focus on is getting better at using this type of interpreting with the paralegal interpreters that you have at NYLAG, so that everybody feels more comfortable using it as well. Okay, now the other type of interpreting that we have is simultaneous. I mentioned that it's used in conferences, it's used at the United Nations, it uses headphones. But one situation where an interpreter might switch to simultaneous mode might be when a speaker can't or shouldn't be made to pause. Perhaps they're relating something especially traumatic, or people are trying to speak over each other. Now, this goes to a question that we had just a few minutes ago, and I don't remember who it was, so feel free to speak up again. But this has to go with, as attorneys, where are we looking in the room when we're using interpreters? Are we looking at the interpreter? Are we looking at the client? Are we potentially looking somewhere in between? And the answer is that interpreters want to be out of the way. They want to be unintrusive and discourage any eye contact. And so what I've taught people here at NYLAG to do, and I'm going to get some comments here from the panel in just a few minutes, will be to talk with us about what that can do for the interpreter and what that can do for their job. And so the interpreter is going to be normally, if we're all meeting in person, positioning themselves next to or maybe even slightly behind the client. And the reason is because the client tends to be the person who's most easily distracted. And it's also the person who most easily might try and establish a relationship with the interpreter instead of with the attorney, or the other side of that attorney-client relationship. And so interpreters position themselves to make themselves less noticeable. That doesn't mean that you need to interfere with their positioning. Just let them sit wherever they need to sit. And of course, the challenge here at NYLAG is that we have people working as paralegals who are communicating with the client, who are also interpreting for the attorneys and staff at NYLAG. And that makes it even more important that as attorneys that we try and reinforce good behavior. There can be some of what's called role confusion, where if you are a person who is interacting with a paralegal, having direct conversations with them, and then that person acts in the role of interpreter, it could be a very natural reaction to turn over to them and say, could you explain to me again what you told me yesterday because I forgot, or I feel like it's relevant to this conversation that I'm trying to have with my attorney. And that temptation is natural. We can all understand that, I think, but it does interfere with the interpreter's job because every time, and I imagine many of you can relate to this, every time the client turns to the interpreter and they start having a conversation between themselves, you might feel left out or confused, or perhaps if you don't know that interpreter or that paralegal well, even feel like that person is having a conversation without you or excluding you from what's going on. And so to avoid that, what we want to do is reinforce, as the attorneys and staff at NYLAG, that when our paralegal interpreters are acting as interpreters, that it's not that we're being rude and shutting them off and saying you can't speak to them at all, but that we want to reinforce that they're there to serve a particular purpose and that they're not there to be an active participant in the conversation so much as to help the attorney and the client have a conversation that is as close to possible as just a two-person conversation, where it's almost as if the paralegal interpreter were not physically present in the room. Okay, so we're making good time on the material. I want to open this up for just a few minutes to questions or comments on positioning. Please give me an idea. At NYLAG these days in 2024, what percent would you guys say, what portion of your meetings with clients happen in person versus on the phone or via Zoom or some other video conference call?
And I'm just going to say, I'm going to guess this changes by unit. So it would be great to hear from a few of you from your unit and maybe just explain which unit you are in.
Yeah, thank you, Maya.
And since
So for
yeah, oh, go. I was going to call on somebody who jumped in.
yeah, sorry, Maya. I was just gonna
Thanks,
say
Jack.
for True, I think we do a lot of like brief stuff over the phone. So you might have a three-way phone call if you include that. But I would say maybe a slight majority happen in person, whether that's like in court or in office client meetings or home visits in some case. So I would say close to 50-50, but maybe a slight majority are in person.
I'm really glad to hear that, Jack, because I was, worried that pretty much everything was going to be done on the phone. 50-50 is still quite a bit phone or virtual, but for most interpreters, it's easier to have an in-person meeting. And so I think that's fantastic to hear. Let's get some more comments and then we'll address the procedures for how you can best use an interpreter in a telephonic conversation.
How about someone from IPU? I'm going to call on you, Maria, because I know you're here with us. Can you tell us what's going on in your unit?
I think we have 50% video call or phone call and in person. It depends on clients and availability from the staff, but I think we have equal meetings.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that the positioning for in-person is still very useful to people because it does still happen quite a bit. But let's talk for a minute about telephonic interpreting and how you can do that. One thing that I did hear, and I'm not ratting out anybody in particular, I promise, names withheld. But one thing I did hear from some people last year in the training was that often it's very difficult to react right in the moment when a call goes to voicemail or people are trying to speak over each other on the phone, or you have to explain even that you're making a phone call through an interpreter. So I have the following suggestions for everybody working with an interpreter when you have a phone call, especially if there's no video, because the face-to-face honestly provides a lot of communication that we don't even think about as human beings because we've been talking to each other almost our whole lives. So first point of suggestion is that before you even pick up the phone or before you dial the client's number, that you have a quick pre-conference, a quick discussion with your interpreter about how you're going to handle the call. And in that quick pre-conference that could be just a few seconds even, you could discuss what are you going to do if the call goes to voicemail. In other words, you might even write down something that you would like the interpreter to say for the voicemail. And you can also just say who's going to be speaking first. So will the interpreter be giving a formal introduction when they make the phone call? Will you start off speaking right away? Has this person had a phone call with an interpreter before? How much explanation is necessary? And then the second thing that you want to do is get the conversation going in a way such that you're not cutting people off, but that there's a natural amount of pause. So what you can do is you can use the same length of speech that you would use in person, just that 1 to 2 sentences or every time you feel like you need to take a breath, and then just let the pause occur and just don't stress about the pauses because the interpreter's job is to take a cue as to when it's their turn to interpret what is said. And it's also the interpreter's job to help the client understand that they need to wait for the interpreter to interpret, even if they understand a little bit of English, because often the hardest person to work with as an interpreter is somebody who's actively learning the other language and is really excited to jump in. We want to make sure that any conversation that we have as attorneys with somebody who's limited English proficient, in other words, perhaps they have some English proficiency, but they're not fully proficient, is fully interpreted because even if they are learning and learning well even, there exists a lot of potential for making mistakes. We don't want our clients to misunderstand something that we're saying to them because if we're making the effort to say it, it is of course something that they need to know. It's something important for their case or to answer a question that they have. And so setting those ground rules and sticking by them and letting the interpreter remind people to let the interpreter interpret and letting the interpreter handle the pace of the conversation and the length of pauses is one of those things that will help you to have much, much better phone conversations when interpreted if you try less to take control of the pace of the conversation. And for many of us who are used to being in charge, which is why I went solo with my own practice, that can be hard to do, but I recommend that you give it a try as much as possible and let the interpreter take control of the flow. Once again, set clear ground rules before you start about who's going to speak first, set ground rules as to how a voicemail will be handled, and let the interpreter take it from there. I see Maybelline's hand is up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hello. So I have a question in the same context. I'm doing talking to a client through a phone. So I do consultations with clients over the phone. So one of the issues that I have is like I ask a question, the interpreter translates, but then the client says whatever he wants to say. So then the interpreter, I believe she has no other option but to translate what he's saying. So then, I mean, it's kind of difficult for me to be rude to the interpreter, say, hey, tell the client to stop or answer what I'm asking. Or maybe before we have the phone call, tell the interpreter, listen, if he answers other questions that I'm not asking, you should stop him. So I don't know how to manage that situation.
Thank you for the question. And it's a very great question. I've heard a lot of similar concerns in the past when speaking with people who use interpreters as well as training interpreters. And I think the best answer to that is as the interpreter, you're going to be interrupting people when necessary when they go on for too long. So as the attorney, one thing that you could do to respond to that when they went on too long is just as the attorney say, I just want to remind you that we're working with an interpreter, so try and pause more often so that I can get everything. I think I got all of that, but I may ask you to repeat some parts of that just to make sure I understood everything. And by reinforcing that behavior, you're helping out the interpreter a lot. I definitely do sympathize though, because there are a lot of times people who have been waiting potentially a long time to be able to speak with an attorney about their case. And when they do, it just kind of all jumbles out, just all falls out at once because they're excited or they're feeling a lot of emotions. And what the interpreter can do in an in-person setting is make physical gestures to interrupt people. But on the phone, that's harder to do. And so what I'm hoping our paralegal interpreters at NYLAG, who are again wonderful, will do on phone calls is be very assertive in interrupting people who go on too long as soon as it's reasonable to do so. And they may have to ask for repetition too. But reinforcing those behaviors and addressing what can we do when a person goes on without pausing for too long is a great idea for you to discuss with the interpreter before you begin the phone call. Maybelline, if you have a follow-up, because I see your hand is still up, feel free, but otherwise I'm going to call on Shelley.
I'm sorry. So my follow-up was, so what you do when they answer a question that you didn't ask, or they just answer whatever they want to say? Yeah.
So it's a great question too. You're on a roll. So in this case, I would say that you should definitely respond as if you were speaking to somebody in English, because just as people who are same language speakers misunderstand one another in conversations, so too people who misunderstand one another in interpreted conversations have ways of working through that misunderstanding. What I've trained the paralegal interpreters at NYLAG, some of them, to do is to note when there's a misunderstanding, but not to jump in and say what the misunderstanding is. The reason is that it's very important for an interpreter to maintain neutrality as much as possible. People who do not speak English in the United States can often feel like they don't have a voice or they're not able to express themselves as they wish. I think we can all imagine why that would be important in working with an attorney at NYLAG, that you get to be able to express yourself and give your opinion and ask questions as you would like them asked. And so if the interpreter says, I think what the point of confusion is that the client doesn't understand this, that makes you feel like your voice is being taken away. And so as the attorney, if you jump in and reinforce those roles for the interpreter to be neutral, and you say, I'm sorry, I think that we're having a misunderstanding. Could you tell me what you mean by X? Or can I repeat that back to you to see if I understood what you said? Then you're treating that person as if they're speaking your same language, and it will generally be a much more positive experience. Okay, so I think I saw Shelley's hand up. Shelley, did you still have a comment that you wanted to make?
You basically addressed it. I would say that
okay.
if the problem is that the client is not understanding you, then it's on you as the attorney to clarify that. It's not on the interpreter.
Fantastic. Great. Maria?
Yes, hi. Yes, it's just working with a paralegal, also interpreter, requires understanding from the attorney as well, because they are interpreting the language, but also the legal term, and handling dual roles in the meeting. So it happened, and it is okay. But yeah, very important to address the role during the meeting respectfully, not only for the interpreter, but also for the client, because client used to be more connected with paralegal because they are handling, more closely with them, and become familiar also for the language, the connection they met because of the language. And yeah, just redirect the role while the meeting, and also speak directly to the client. The attorney address the question to clients, the conversation with client. It will give, the sense that the interpreter is there as a facilitator for the language, but not as a paralegal in the moment. But sometimes it may confuse, even for us, as a paralegal and interpreter is confused, the roles.
Absolutely.
Because we are doing both roles in the same meeting sometimes, and because we know the practice and we know the language, but we also know some policies, and It is very challenging and requires understanding from the attorney.
Thank you so much, Maria. Denise, did you also have a comment?
Yeah, so in terms of positioning, I had this recent experience where I was just there to be an interpreter, had no sense of like the case, and the client brought in a second person to the room, and this second person was taking up all the time of like speaking, and it came to the point where the client was no longer answering the questions, rather the second person. And I was very confused as to like who was this person, and the attorney was like not really stepping in during the conversation, and it was therefore after that the session was ended, and the attorney was like, well, I didn't get my answers cleared because this person is not really like our client. As interpreters, is that like also part of our job to assess who's in the room and the relevance to the conversation? Or is that more so for the attorney?
So I think it's great, Denise, that you're asking this question, because I can see that this is a question that probably both NYLAG paralegals and NYLAG attorneys might have. And the answer is that traditionally, this is the attorney's job. The attorney and the client are responsible for the content of the conversation. The interpreter is responsible for the flow of the conversation. So unlike the question that was asked just a minute ago, and I'm so sorry because the position of everybody's camera keeps changing here on the Zoom screen, I'm going to lose your names. But somebody had commented just a minute ago, an attorney, that in phone calls, they have a problem with the client not pausing. And while an attorney can certainly help reinforce the interpreter in that case, that is the interpreter's job to make sure that they manage the flow of the conversation. On the other hand, your question, Denise, was more about, who's in charge of managing the content of the conversation and who's speaking. That is firmly in the attorney's field, in their own area of expertise. So the answer to your question is no, that's not your responsibility. All right, we have time for just one or two more comments before we go on, if anybody has one. Okay, great. So when interpreters position, they generally will try, if there's more than one client in the room, to sit on the side of all the clients, not sit in the middle of them. This is again because as the interpreter, you don't want to be the center of anything, the center of attention especially. And you can feel free as the attorney not to make eye contact or make regular niceties with the interpreter. I'm not saying that you have to treat them as taboo or like they literally don't exist. Just, if you're offering water, you don't have to necessarily make a big deal of offering water to the interpreter. You can just either hand it to them without any verbal communication, which the interpreter, their job is easier that way, or you can let them serve themselves. You certainly also don't need to make a big deal about introducing the interpreter. The interpreter is able to introduce themselves. So if the positioning in the room is difficult, listen to the interpreter. Otherwise, just go ahead and start having the conversation. There's no reason to treat it as something that's complicated or different from a normal conversation, because the interpreter is there to take care of that and make it feel more natural. All right, now there is a time where the interpreter, unlike in their normal positioning, is going to call attention to themselves. And instead of just repeating what everybody else says, the interpreter is going to speak what we say as the interpreter. In other words, they're going to add new content to the conversation instead of repeating other people's content, other people's meaning when they're saying what they're saying. And here's some examples of when an interpreter might stand up and speak as the interpreter to solve problems. One thing might be that the interpreter needs a repetition. Either they just didn't hear it clearly because somebody wasn't speaking loudly enough, the phone signal wasn't very good, the person spoke for too long, or the interpreter wasn't sure about what context they were using a word in, or whether or not they mispronounced something. Another idea is that the interpreter may problem solve or interrupt, to ask the speaker to use shorter sentences or to pause more often. This goes again back to the problem that some people are having during phone calls, where a client may go on for too long without pausing and you feel like you can't get a word in. The parties might be talking over the interpreter, in which case the interpreter needs to reassert the rules. The interpreter is not familiar with a term, which does happen. The interpreter could say several things. They could say simply, the interpreter needs an explanation of, and we'll go through a practice of that one in just a few minutes. The LEP person, in other words, the client, appears confused. They may try and problem solve by noting that there might be a confusion, or asking the attorney, actually, this is something I've trained people here at NYLAG to do, asking the attorney to check for understanding with the client to see whether or not there was a problem with the interpretation or something that made the LEP person confused. There might also be a cultural difference causing a misunderstanding, and many others. There's just literally hundreds of things that could happen that would cause an interpreter to have to interrupt to problem solve. As attorneys and staff, the most important thing for you to know about when interpreters problem solve is that they're going to be repeating everything in both languages. So when an interpreter interrupts to ask for repetition, please don't be confused or distracted when the interpreter then repeats that in a non-English language. What they're doing is simply for the sake of transparency and neutrality, they're saying what they said to you to the client so that the client understands what they said with you. This is to avoid something called a side conversation. And that side conversation is, again, simply when somebody feels left out of a conversation because not everything that was said was repeated. So these are all examples of appropriate and maybe even necessary problem solving. The interpreter is responsible for interpreting everything that's said accurately and completely. And this is, again, something that we're going to cover in a few minutes with our practices. However, we do also teach interpreters in training courses that you should only problem solve when it's necessary. You shouldn't just do it whenever you feel like it. The reason is because it calls more attention than necessary to the interpreter. It can cause further confusion if people try and engage the interpreter again in a conversation once they speak up. And it might undermine the attorney-client relationship. And again, in NYLAG, where we have people who are acting both as interpreters and as paralegals, this is especially likely to occur. And so we want to make sure that whenever we use a paralegal interpreter as an interpreter, that if they do problem solve because they just didn't hear a word or they didn't understand, or somebody's going on too long and they need to reinforce the rules, that instead of speaking to the interpreter, that we just continue speaking to the client. Because anytime somebody needs to speak to the interpreter and the interpreter has to respond, the interpreter is doing triple the work. They're repeating your words and then they're saying what they have to say twice. So that really slows down the conversation and creates a lot of space for confusion and error. As I mentioned just a minute ago, one of the main goals of interpreting is to be transparent and neutral. And transparency means that everything that is said includes both sides, both the attorney and the client. And one example here, aside from the examples I already gave, might be that an attorney uses a term that doesn't exist in another language. This exists for many languages, surprisingly. We don't have an exact equivalent. So what you might do if you don't know exactly how to handle that term as an interpreter would be to ask for an explanation. My heartfelt suggestion to everybody is that if a paralegal interpreter at NYLAG asks for you to explain a concept, don't assume that they don't know what the concept means. It just may be that they're having difficulty explaining that concept in a different language, which can be really distinct from being able to explain it in English. And so giving the explanation helps them to be able to process how to interpret that concept. It may also be that sometimes a paralegal interpreter at NYLAG is doing that because they sense that there was confusion in the client. And so hearing you explain it and interpreting your explanation is actually easier for the interpreter than for them to try and give an explanation as the interpreter, because again, then they have to repeat themselves to you to say so that you, the attorney, know what they said. And so when a paralegal interpreter gives you a hint that they would like an explanation or they would like you to check for understanding, my, again, heartfelt suggestion is please don't take offense. This is not because the interpreter is trying to cause problems or play dumb. It's simply because this is the easiest way to handle the problem for interpreters given the rules that they have. All right, so we covered this a little bit when we talked about phone calls, but a pre-session is just simply a short meeting, or it could even be an exchange of emails to explain how the rules are going to go in the session, which means the interpreted conversation. And what I really suggest is that if you haven't worked with a paralegal interpreter before, if you're not used to working with interpreters, or if you're going to have a phone call, that you meet for just as little as 30 seconds. I know on this slide it says 5 to 15 minutes, but in reality, it's often much shorter. And when you meet with that person, just establish how are introductions going to be made. What happens if it goes to voicemail, if it happens to be a phone call? Talk about who's going to be responsible for, enforcing the rules, that people take breaks, that people get to speak. Lindsay, thank you so much. I see your hand is raised. Go ahead if you have a question or a comment.
Hi, yeah, sorry if you mentioned this before, but I just had a question going off the previous slide. When we have a clarification that we want to make, and we're asking the attorney to possibly re-describe a term, do we explain to the person we're interpreting, like the client, do we explain that we're asking for a repetition of the term or a different definition?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Gosh, this is what makes me feel at home is answering interpreter questions for potential interpreters. In this case, what you should do is follow 4 basic steps. First is you should pause what you're doing. You should make it clear that you're speaking as the interpreter. You should state the problem or your request, and then repeat that in the second language. So that might look something like this. Excuse me, this is the interpreter. I need everyone to pause more often. And then you would say, perdón, habla el intérprete, necesito que todos tomen pausas más a menudo. O pausen más a menudo. So what I'm doing there is I'm stopping, I'm speaking as the interpreter, and then I'm saying it in both languages. And that will make it transparent and clear to everybody, as well as being very brief.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so we've talked about pre-sessions. We've talked about first-person speech. We've talked about how when we are having phone calls that you should establish some ground rules. We've talked about how to handle issues with clients speaking too long or the wrong client speaking. Here's just a couple more items before we go through one more video. This video is not nearly as funny, but it does illustrate a lot of the concepts that we've gone through and some new concepts before we get to our practices and breakout. So as parting wisdom, pause after each breath, avoid using slang and idioms. Please do accept interpreter invitations to check for understanding, and try and make sure that you're building confidence and a direct relationship with the client, not letting the client focus on their relationship with the interpreter. Some suggestions that I have real quickly about how to state a check for understanding, and I don't want to preach to the choir because I know that many of you are already skilled at this, but for anybody who might need a review, is you might say something like, I need to know how well I explain this, which parts were most confusing. Or you might say, you may need to show the judge that I explained this concept and you understood it. How would you explain blank to the judge, or how would you explain it to your friend or to a child? Or why do you think blank is important to your case? What I would suggest is, from a cross-cultural competence perspective, that you avoid asking things like, did you understand? Or do you feel comfortable? Or does that answer your question? Because in many cultures, and culture is not monolithic, everybody might react differently even from the same culture, you might have people that just say yes to be deferential, that want to not offend or disrespect you or cause any kind of friction in the relationship. And so even though they did not understand, or even though they are not giving what I think would be a knowing and voluntary consent to something important, potentially, you're going to get that yes answer. And so by having them either explain it back to you or to identify a particular concept or an important point in what you explained, you're making them engage with what your message was. Maya?
Yeah, I have a quick question for you that maybe you're going to address this later. When you say avoid slang and idioms, I'm also wondering about legalese, which we teach people not, to try to avoid legalese generally, but I'm just wondering if you can address a little bit the problem with legalese, using legalese specifically when it's an interpretation situation.
Yes. Okay. So when we had our practice last year, Maya, as you were so great in helping us design that, we talked about how at NYLAG, interpreters are allowed to simplify what the attorney says. So first of all, just from a starting point, I want everybody to be aware that interpreters may be doing that when you're working with an interpreter at NYLAG. The second is that because the interpreter's job is just to put people on the same level as if they were all speaking the same language, you as the attorney should still be aware that you may be speaking over somebody. And that can be dangerous. In a particular example that we'll do in the practice, if somebody is referring to something like a parole and the client has no context or experience with this word, they may get confused about what you're referring to, or just assume that you're not meant to understand. And that can really take away from the potential to help somebody as a client of NYLAG as the organization. Maya, did you want to add anything to that?
I think later on, maybe when we hear from our paralegals, I do remember some folks said that is particularly can create particularly challenging situations. So maybe when we get to our panel at the end, we can see if folks want to weigh in on that.
I think that's a great idea. Thank you. All right. So just a few more notes about these points. One is that you don't have to keep this as an exact rule. Is a rule of thumb when you pause after each breath, that really a beginning goal for interpreters in foundational courses is interpreting 25 words at a time. That tends to only be 2, maximum 3 sentences. I put here 1 to 2 sentences in this slide because I noticed that as attorneys, we tend to have longer sentences. So keep in mind that, please, if you're going on for more than 1 or 2 sentences at a time, what you're doing is you're introducing a higher risk that what you're saying will be misinterpreted. And then lastly, interpreters are trying to actually do many things at once, even though it appears they're only repeating you. They're listening, remembering, converting, repeating, and maintaining awareness of the flow of communication all at the same time. Now, we talked about slang and idioms as well as legalese. They're all infamous for being difficult to interpret well. They can have an unclear meaning, and you should avoid them whenever possible. Some additional suggestions for things that would be better to avoid. Not that I want to kill all humor. I do really appreciate it myself, but please try and avoid puns. They don't ever translate. Please try to avoid long jokes. If you feel the need to relieve tension using some kind of humor, physical humor is often the simplest. Please avoid compound questions. If you've ever been taken to task by a judge for that, please remember it's difficult for interpreters as well. And please avoid interruptions. So if the interpreter is interpreting, even if you already understood what they said, please just let them finish. That way it provides transparency for everybody. Okay, and then we already went over actually how to check for understanding. So I'm just going to go here to our video at the end. Again, this video wraps up what we've covered so far in this section. And the video, like many of the videos that I have, is meant for an interpreting audience. But here in this video, we have someone on the left in the blue shirt who's playing the role of a caseworker or perhaps an attorney. We have the woman in the khakis who's playing the role of the interpreter. And we have the man on the right who is going to be our client or limited English proficient LEP person. And here you're going to see a training on positioning, on first person speech, on pausing, and on clarifying a term. And what I want people to do when they watch this video is just take notes on the differences between the good and the bad practices. Here we go.
When a language barrier exists, the presence of a professional interpreter is crucial. A professional interpreter facilitates unobstructed communication, and when this is done right, a good interpreter begins to become transparent as they act as a conduit for the conversation. In this video, you will see common mistakes of an untrained interpreter, followed by the proper technique of a professional interpreter.
Hello. All right. Let him know that I'm glad he's here today.
Dice que está muy contento que está aquí hoy.
I just want to start out asking him some basic questions, so let him know that I'm going to do that.
Él dice que le va a hacer unas preguntas básicas.
Asking who lives in his house.
Él quiere saber quién vive en su casa.
Pues vivo yo, mi esposa y mis 4 niños.
Said that it's himself, his wife, and his 4 children.
Okay, what are their ages?
¿Y cuántos años tienen sus hijos? Él quiere saber.
Uno tiene 13 años, 10, 5 y 2.
He said that his children are 15, 10, 5, and 2.
Thank you for being here today.
Gracias por venir hoy.
I really appreciate you coming out.
Y aprecio que está aquí hoy.
I just want to start by asking you just some basic questions.
Me quiero hacer unas preguntas básicas.
Who all lives at your house?
¿Quiénes son los que viven en su casa?
Vivo yo, mi esposa y mis 4 niños.
It's myself, my wife, and my 4 children.
Okay, what are their ages? Children.
¿Y sus hijos cuántos años tienen?
Uno tiene 13 años, 10, 5 y 2 años.
One's 13, 10, 5, and 2 years.
Okay.
Studying.
Whenever possible, an interpreter should sit to the side and slightly behind the target language speaker. As you saw in the video, this emphasizes the message, not the interpreter. It reduces distraction and allows the parties to engage each other, not the interpreter.
Mr. Sanchez, do you know why you're here today?
El señor Sánchez, él quiere saber si usted sabe por qué está aquí hoy.
Yo no tengo la menor idea por qué usted está aquí.
He said he has no idea why you're here.
Well, I received a report with some concerns about your son Luis.
Él dice que recibió un reporte que se trata de unas preocupaciones de su hijo Luis.
¿Qué tipo de preocupaciones?
He wants to know what kind of concerns.
Okay, well, the report says that Luis has an injury to his eye, and I'm concerned about that.
Él dice que según el reporte, Luis tiene unas lesiones al ojo y está preocupado.
¿Que Luis está preocupado por su ojo?
No, él dice que él está preocupado por lo que encontró con Luis.
¿Qué tipo de preocupación tiene él?
He wants to know what kind of concerns you have.
Mr. Sanchez, do you know why you're here today?
Señor Sánchez, ¿sabe por qué estamos aquí hoy?
No tengo la menor idea por qué.
No, I have no idea why.
Okay, well, I received a report that has some concerns about your son, Luis.
Recibí un reporte que se trata de las preocupaciones de su hijo Luis.
¿Qué tipo de preocupaciones?
What type of concerns?
Well, there's concerns about something that happened to his eye.
Unas preocupaciones de algo que sucedió con el ojo de Luis.
¿Qué pasó? ¿Cuál es su preocupación?
Well, what happened? What's your concern?
A trained interpreter should always interpret in first person. This is the standard of professional interpreting. It allows the interpreter to become transparent, allows for a more accurate message to be conveyed, and reduces third-person confusion.
How did Luis end up with a black eye?
¿Y cómo llegó a tener un ojo negro, moretón en el ojo?
Pues él se golpeó con no, él estuvo en una pelea.
He was in a fight.
He's in a fight? Okay, can you tell me about this fight?
¿Me puede contar un poco de este pleito?
Pues él estaba en el camión de la escuela camino a casa.
y hubo dos muchachos que empezaron a molestarlo y le trataron de quitar su dinero o le quitaron su dinero y le pegaron y le marcaron un ojo.
There were some boys on the bus that hit him in the eye.
Okay. What else happened?
¿Y qué más pasó?
Pues cuando él llegó a la casa y me dijo, yo le dije a él que él tenía que aprender a defenderse, que él era muy blandito, tenía que ser más valiente y pelear.
I told him to stick up for himself.
Okay.
So what happened to Luis's eye?
Entonces, ¿qué pasó con el ojo de Luis?
Pues él se golpeó con, no, él venía en el camión de la escuela y había unos muchachos que lo estaban molestando y lo golpearon en el ojo y le quitaron el dinero.
Well, he ran into no, actually, he was on the school bus and some young men were bothering him and they hit him in the eye and took his money.
Okay, so this happened on the school bus?
Entonces, ¿esto pasó en el bus escolar?
Sí, fue en el camión de la escuela.
Yes, it was in the school bus.
Okay, so if it happened on the school bus, we can get the video camera from the school bus and see what happened.
Entonces, si sucedió en el bus escolar, podemos ver el video que siempre toma el bus escolar para ver si realmente pasó.
Bueno, tal vez no sea necesario porque pensando lo mejor, yo creo que eso pasó más tarde.
Well, maybe it's not the best idea. Not thinking about it, it might have happened later on.
Interpreters should never add, omit, or substitute any part of the message, even if it seems redundant, irrelevant, or rude. When an interpreter adds or omits, it generally takes away from the message, eliminates useful information, and can change the intent of the message.
Just wait 1 second, I need to look through some papers real quick.
Espera un momento, tengo que ver mis notas aquí.
¿Y dónde aprendiste a hablar español?
En Honduras.
¿Honduras?
Sí.
Mi esposa es de Honduras,
¿Ah, sí? ¿De cuál parte?
de La Ceiba.
De veras. Yo soy de La Ceiba también. Bueno, desde niña vivía allá.
Oh, qué bien.
Sí.
What were you guys saying?
Oh, we're actually from the same place.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I have a few more questions for you, Mr. Sanchez.
Tengo unas preguntas más para preguntarle, señor Sánchez.
Hold on 1 second, I need to look through my notes.
Espera un momento, tengo que revisar mis notas.
¿Dónde aprendió usted español?
En Honduras.
En Honduras, mi esposa es de Honduras,
Sí, de cuál parte.
de La Ceiba.
He's actually asking me where I learned Spanish. I let him know Honduras, and his wife is from the same place where I grew up.
Okay, well, Mr. Sanchez, I have a few more questions for you.
Señor Sánchez, tengo una pregunta para usted.
Side conversations should be rare and should never exclude the other party. Ensuring that everything is interpreted reduces suspicion and confusion. Further, interpreting everything ensures that professional role boundaries are maintained.
All right. So, I am sure that more people than just our paralegal interpreters have comments or questions. What comments or questions do we have about the material we've covered?
I had a question about how we can support the paralegal interpreters if there is a situation happening where the client is, repeatedly just directing their questions or side questions directly to the interpreter. It seems like I've witnessed that happen even when the interpreter is doing their best to minimize those, and I'm wondering how we can kind of also assist them when that's happening.
Thank you very much for that question. I would say the biggest thing that you can do to address rule breaking clients, and when I say rule breaking, I mean not following the rules that we have for an interpreted session, is to tell them what the interpreter says when they are problem solving. So if you notice that a client is not behaving like they should, and the interpreter pauses and says, "This is the interpreter. I need you to wait for me to finish interpreting before you speak." And then you see them do it again. Don't wait for the interpreter to problem solve again. Just reinforce that behavior. Just say, "Hey, she's asked you to wait until she's finished before you speak. Please respect that." And just by echoing that comment, what you're doing is you're saving the interpreter work, which is also very valuable, but you are letting them know that that's your role. That's something that they need to respect, because our clients often see us as the people who are in charge, the people with the authority in the room. And saying that really gives them legitimacy so that in the future, somebody will listen to them again when they are problem solving.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. But I would add to that while you can feel free to enforce rules about reminding people to pause for the interpreter or wait until interpretation is done, you should probably defer to the interpreter as to whether they think something else that you think might be not appropriate is appropriate. Let the interpreter make a call as to whether or not they want to problem solve that issue. If it has to do with the flow of communication, you're of course as the attorney responsible for what is talked about, the content of the communication. All right, we have time for one or two before we go on to the practice, if anybody has it. Even if it's not a burning question, if it's just smoldering, we can still take it, I promise. Okay, well, Maya, what do you think? Should we go on to the practices?
I was just wondering if you want to do a little break at some point, either now or after the practices.
You know, I should take that into account, shouldn't I? Let's take maybe a 10-minute break now, if that's fine with you.
Yeah, do we have time for 10 minutes? That's great.
Yeah, I think we have time. Let's go ahead and do it.
Okay, great. So we'll see you all back at 2:30.
Great.
Yeah. I'm gonna break already.
All right, let's go ahead and get a sound off from our paralegal interpreters who are here. Denise, are you there? Rogelio, good. Okay, Shelly, are you there? Okay, Shelly's saying 1 sec, no problem at all. Maya, I think it was, am I missing somebody? Were there 4? Or do we just had Shelly, Denise, and
We had Maria. Hold on 1 second. Let me just see if she.
yeah, Maria was our person who was missing. Okay.
Hold on, let me just see.
Although, come to think of it, Maya, given how we're doing on time and given that the group is actually not as large, what
Yeah,
do you think if we just did a demonstration instead of breaking into breakout
sure,
rooms?
let's do it that way. That sounds great.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
that's easier.
So that
Mhm.
actually allows us to use our interpreting talent that we have present in the room a lot more easily. So, Rogelio, I seem to remember that you're a Spanish interpreter, is that right? Okay, great. And Shelly, were you also a Spanish interpreter?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, between the two of you, who would like to deliver lines in Spanish and who would like to deliver lines in English?
How do you feel, Shelly? I really don't have no preference.
I don't mind being the or is this about which of us would be the client as opposed to the interpreter?
Yeah, so I think we have an
Or the
opportunity
attorney.
here where somebody could deliver the client's lines in Spanish, and that would help make the practice feel more real, or the demonstration to feel
Yeah.
more real for everybody.
Yeah, I don't mind playing the client.
You don't mind? Thank you so much for
Yeah.
volunteering. And Rogelio, would you like to be the attorney?
Sure.
Okay, and that means I'll play the role of the interpreter. And for everybody else's benefit, what we're going to be doing here in this section is we're going to go through a couple of demonstrations where we just do a skit in front of all of you. This has some good interpreting behavior as well as some good attorney behavior that we're going to demonstrate in this first one. But in the first one, and I think possibly many of you have had this experience, the client is going to try and have side conversations with the interpreter. So they're going to try and engage the interpreter in, questions like, what is the attorney talking about? And so what we're going to model is for you guys to all see it and come to expect the correct behavior. The interpreter is just going to keep maintaining transparent communication and not engage in side conversations in this particular practice. So we're going to show that to you. Then we have some discussion questions. My request is, since we're all up here entertaining everybody this afternoon, that you engage in our discussion questions so that we can have everything run smoothly. So thank you in advance for your participation. All right, so we're starting off with our attorney, Rogelio, whenever you're ready.
All right. Good morning. Thank you for coming in. Please take a seat.
Buenos días, gracias por llegar. Por favor, tome asiento.
Buenos días, gracias.
Good morning, thank you.
My staff tells me that you should schedule an appointment for today to discuss getting a parole in place under the new policy. Is that correct?
Los gerentes aquí en la oficina me avisan de que usted fijó una cita para hoy para platicar juntos sobre un parole in place bajo la nueva política. ¿Es correcto?
Sí, la nueva política significa que puedo obtener mi green card porque ya he tenido en este país por 10 años.
Sí, la nueva política. Yes, the new policy means that I can get a green card because I've been here for 10 years.
Are you talking about cancellation of removal or parole in place?
¿Me está hablando de la cancelación de expulsión o el parole in place?
No sé lo que esto significa.
I don't know what that means. Imagining that we're all here in the same room, this is something that the client just said to me as the interpreter, so everybody's aware.
That's okay. Please let me explain. There is a new policy announced by the president.
Está bien. Por favor, permítame explicarlo. Hay una nueva política anunciada por el presidente.
The policy says that someone who is married to a U.S. citizen and has been in the United States for 10 years or more may be able to get a green card.
La nueva póliza o política dice que alguien que hace 10 años o más que está aquí en Estados Unidos y quien está casado con un ciudadano estadounidense puede ser que obtenga un green card.
This policy applies mainly to people who did not have a visa to enter the United States.
Más que nada, esta política aplica a las personas quienes no llevaban visa para poder entrar legalmente a los Estados Unidos.
There's also something called cancellation of removal, which is where you get a green card in immigration court.
También existe algo que se llama la cancelación de expulsión, el cual se refiere a cuando alguien recibe un green card en la corte o tribunal de inmigración.
With cancellation of removal, you also need to have been here for 10 years. You also need to show that your family members with immigration status would suffer if you were deported.
Con la cancelación de expulsión, es necesario que usted haya estado aquí ya por 10 años. Necesita enseñar a los miembros de su familia que los miembros de su familia con un estatus migratorio sufrirían si usted fuese deportado.
Were you talking about the new President Biden policy or the immigration court application?
¿Estaba usted platicando sobre esta nueva política del presidente Biden o la solicitud que se hace ante el Tribunal de Inmigración?
¿Por qué el abogado continúa hablando sobre 10 años? Lo que quiero es la libertad condicional.
Why does the lawyer keep talking about 10 years? I want a parole. This is the interpreter speaking. I must repeat everything that is said. Please do not speak to me directly while I am interpreting. Habla el intérprete. Debo de repetir todo lo que se diga. Por favor, no se dirijan a mí mientras que yo estoy interpretando.
Lo que a mí me gustaría sería el parole, la libertad condicional, por favor.
I would like the parole for a green card, please.
Okay, and this is a parole under the new policy from the president, correct?
Okay, y esta libertad condicional es bajo la nueva política del presidente, ¿cierto?
Sí, cierto.
Yes, that's right.
Have you been arrested in the United States or elsewhere?
¿Alguna vez fue arrestada en Estados Unidos o en otro lugar?
No.
No.
How many times have you entered the United States?
¿Cuántas veces ha llegado usted a los Estados Unidos?
¿Tengo que decir la verdad?
Do I have to tell the truth?
Everything that is said here is confidential. I will not repeat what you say to anyone outside of this office.
Todo lo que usted diga aquí se mantiene confidencial. Yo no voy a repetir lo que usted me diga a nadie fuera de esta oficina. Okay, well, first of all, applause. Thank you very much to my wonderful teammates. This was a bit difficult to illustrate here on Zoom because, of course, it's not always clear who somebody is speaking to on Zoom. But what we had was, on 2 occasions at least, the client was trying to engage the interpreter in a side conversation. And what I want you guys to feel comfortable with is that potentially awkward moment where the interpreter repeats exactly what the client says when they're trying to engage them in a side conversation. This is considered best practice, just almost universally by professional interpreters, is that if there needs to be a response, we can respond. But when there are questions that can just be repeated, especially if it's repeated to the attorney, who's the person in charge, then that's generally what an interpreter should do. What did you guys think about this? Was there anything that seemed like, not because of our performance, but seemed like it might have been an awkward point in the conversation or something likely to cause confusion?
I thought that. Oh, go ahead, Rogelio.
Yeah, let's.
Oh, go ahead, Jack. You go ahead.
Okay,
For
let's
sure.
take Jack first. Yeah, go ahead.
I just thought that it was well done where like you had a really complicated policy matter to explain, and it would be really easy to sort of like go right through that as one enormous message. But I thought it was done really well where the attorney kind of took it in bite-sized chunks, allowing the interpreter to sort of get that out along the way. That can be a little awkward, I feel like, because it's a really irregular method of speaking. Like we would never talk like that. And, you know, if you didn't have somebody, or excuse me, if you had somebody who spoke your own language, the same language, but it works really well in this case when you have to disseminate such a large chunk of information.
Yeah, and I think what you guys will notice, or at least what I've noticed working with interpreters, because you know, I'm bilingual, but I'm not multilingual, and I work with people, with clients who speak several languages. And when I work with interpreters myself, I noticed that once you get into a good rhythm, it's not actually as awkward as it seems for one person to give a long explanation as long as they break it up. So thank you, Jack. Rogelio?
Yeah, I just adding to what Jack said, the pacing was important because there's definitely certain points where the conversation can trigger something to the client. This is obviously a very sensitive conversation. And I've been in positions where when both the attorney and the interpreter or myself are in the same wavelength, it really does help the client understand that we're coming with this at a sensitive point where they feel comfortable to express all the information that we need from them.
Great. Thank you to both of you. All right. Any more comments before we move on to our second practice? Okay. Well, I for one am really liking this format because I feel it's also a bit more speedy than breakout rooms. Go ahead, Maya.
I just had a question for you. Is it possible that the lawyer could have been, and maybe I'm just being nitpicky, but a little bit clearer so that the client didn't still have another question about parole? Like, I'm just wondering, maybe it's too, I don't know this area of law, so maybe it's just very complicated, but I was just wondering if you feel like they could have done a better job of tying it back to the word that the client knows. I don't know.
Oh, for sure, for sure. You know, I'll confess, when I wrote this practice, I started with the problem that I wanted to address and wrote backwards from there. So, yes, I think you'll notice that we have imperfect characters behaving in these practices, and that's on purpose. Some other issues that I was thinking about as we went through this practice together, because I wasn't preparing myself to be the interpreter, but that's where you end up sometimes as the teacher, is that, you know, Shelley, you, I think, were using a term for parole that can be favored in criminal contexts, but
Yeah, that
not in
was
immigration. Yeah.
that was me where I don't work in immigration, and
Yeah.
so I don't have knowledge of how parole is phrased in an immigration context. So that was entirely a problem.
No, I
Performing the role.
I wanted to, on the one hand, compliment you because parole is a very specific vocabulary. It's a very specific term, but you know, just so everybody else is aware, the reason I'm doing this is not to really rag on Shelley, but just so everybody else knows, you know, these legal terminology terms, they vary between fields of law as well, and so that can be an additional factor that could cause an interpreter to ask for clarification. So what I'm saying here is let's give our interpreters some sympathy and some space as well when we're working with them. Okay, great. So I think Denise, is Denise here? Yeah, Denise, we gave you a pass the first time. So we're definitely going to include you this time if that's okay with you. Do you have the script?
Yes.
Okay, and I realize I'm actually getting ahead of myself. We haven't quite gone through everything. So let me just ask everybody here in the group, if you were the attorney in this situation, at what point would you have realized that the client was confused about what you meant? And do you think that that might have been a different point than when the interpreter realized that there was a confusion? I want to kind of draw out this point a bit because I think it's essential for us to understand as attorneys working with interpreters. I'll take this one. So one thing that I've noticed is interpreters often realize that there's a misunderstanding before either the client or the attorney. And this is understandable because as the interpreter, you're repeating everything. So you're really kind of involved in the conversation, even if you're not speaking your own words. And often I think one thing that we can do to improve, not necessarily that it's bad or that we're doing anything wrong, but one thing that we can do to improve how we work with interpreters is to take nonverbal cues. Sometimes an interpreter will give a nonverbal cue that they've noticed something is wrong, and that can also be a cue for you as the attorney to look for something that might have occurred that might be a misunderstanding. So I'll just add that as well to the discussion. All right, Denise, would you feel brave and play the role of the client for us? Is that something you'd be up for? Okay, great. I know I'm putting you on the spot, so I really appreciate it. All right, and who did we have being our attorney last time? I think that was Rogelio. Yeah, Rogelio, you did a great job. If you wouldn't mind doing it again, I'd appreciate it. Great. Okay, so again, Rogelio, we are starting with you. For everybody who is here in the class, I just want to explain that this time we have an attorney who is not demonstrating ideal behavior. Again, I wrote this backwards from the problem, so if I make the attorney in this script look bad, it's not with any intention of saying that attorneys at NYLAG are anything other than excellent. But I just want you guys to know that I wrote backwards from a problem. All right, go ahead, Rogelio.
Come in, sit down, please. I'm glad you're here.
Pase, por favor, tome asiento. Me alegro que usted está aquí hoy.
I only have a few minutes to go over this with you before we meet with the prosecutor.
Solo tengo un par de minutos para reunirme con usted antes que nos reunamos con el fiscal.
Do you remember our discussion about your plea agreement?
¿Se acuerda usted de la charla que tuvimos sobre el convenio declaratorio?
Me acuerdo que eso significa que no tenemos juicio.
I remember this means we don't have to have a trial.
Yes, great. So the plea agreement the prosecutor's offering says that you will admit guilt for sexual battery.
Sí, bueno, así que el acuerdo declaratorio del fiscal lo que él ofrece dice que usted admite la culpa de la agresión física sexual.
And then you will be released after the judge sentences you time to serve.
Y le van a dar de alta de la cárcel una vez que el juez le dé la sentencia por tiempo encarcelado.
What do you think?
¿Qué opina usted?
No sé, hay un problema si digo que soy culpable.
I don't know. Is there a problem with saying I'm guilty?
Well, I'm supposed to explain to you that this plea could have immigration consequences, including making you forever inadmissible.
Y bueno, se me hace necesario explicarle que este convenio declaratorio puede tener consecuencias inmigratorias, incluso hacer que usted sea por siempre inadmisible. The interpreter needs a repetition. El intérprete necesita una repetición.
This plea agreement can make you inadmissible to the United States.
Este acuerdo declaratorio puede hacer que usted sea siempre inadmisible a los Estados Unidos.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. So what would you like to do?
Y bueno, ¿qué le gustaría hacer? The interpreter requests an explanation of the word inadmissible. El intérprete pide que se explique la palabra inadmisible.
Inadmissible basically means you will not be able to get a green card or re-enter the United States.
Inadmisible básicamente quiere decir que usted no podrá obtener una green card o poder entrar de nuevo a los Estados Unidos.
Yo no quiero eso.
I don't want that.
What would you like to ask for then?
Entonces, ¿qué es lo que le gustaría pedir?
No sé, pero no eso.
I don't know, but not that.
If you reject this plea agreement, I will try to get you a better offer, but the prosecutor may not make us another offer.
Si rechazamos este acuerdo declaratorio, voy a procurar obtenerle algo mejor, pero el fiscal puede ser que no nos haga otra oferta.
Do you understand that?
¿Se entiende esto?
Sí, supongo.
Yeah, I guess.
And is this a knowing and voluntary consent for me to accept the plea agreement on your behalf?
¿Y es esto un consentimiento voluntario y a sabiendas para que yo acepte el convenio declaratorio a favor suyo? The interpreter requests that you speak more plainly. El intérprete pide que usted hable más claramente y sencillamente. All right. So once again, thank you guys for participating. I really appreciate that. All right. So I don't know if we have a criminal defense unit at NYLAG. I suppose not, which is part of why I chose this, is I didn't think you guys had that section. But for anybody who has worked with criminal defense attorneys, of course, you know, pressuring somebody minutes before a meeting with the prosecutor into a plea agreement, not best practice. But aside from the ethical issues here, what were some barriers that people noticed that the client was facing in understanding what was going on?
It felt rushed. I felt like
Yeah,
even as a
Rogelio.
person being the attorney, I felt like I was rushing into getting something done without actually being without actually listening to my client or understanding where they're at.
Yeah, right. So there were some definite problems with some vocabulary, some terminology, and then also, yeah, just in general, not best practice by the attorney in this case, not making any kind of insinuations about NYLAG attorneys in the very least. But yes, that did feel rushed as well. I totally agree. Denise, I think you had your hand, or was that Shelley?
It was me. You actually just said it. The terminology that the attorney was using was very complex for the client to understand. And so the interpreter had to sort of break character, if that makes sense, and ask the attorney to break down the terminology.
Yes. Okay, great. So one thing that the interpreter does here, since I wrote the script, I get to take the credit, I guess, is the interpreter started off by just asking for an explanation of the word, but that's effectively the same for the interpreter as asking the attorney to speak more plainly. So the interpreter does both here, but what I want attorneys and staff working with interpreters at NYLAG to know is this may not necessarily be because the interpreter doesn't understand. It's an attempt for the attorney to take a cue that you may be speaking with what we call too high of a register. Now, one thing that I didn't get a chance to say is that several times people have commented to me that at NYLAG, attorneys and staff may ask people who are paralegal interpreters to read documents into another language. For example, if you have, just like a simple know your rights form, that you might hand that to the paralegal interpreter and say, could you read this to the client in Spanish or, language X? And that presents a different problem for the interpreter, because if you're doing that, the language in the document is often complex. And so my request on behalf of, paralegal interpreter staff and on behalf of everybody that you will use as interpreters is that you take a look at a document before you ask an interpreter to read it and see if it uses legal jargon. Because if it does, the chances are that even if the paralegal interpreter does a perfect job sight translating that document, as we call it, that it won't result in the client understanding what the document means. Okay, great. Well, we have our panel right now, so without further ado, we'll transition to that. And for our panel, if I'm understanding correctly, we have Rogelio, Denise, and Shelly. Is that correct, Maya? Okay, great. Just want to make sure I wasn't leaving anybody out. So we have here our quick panel questions, and I'm going to see how we do with time. But since there's 3 of you, what I'm going to do is try and get you all to answer the questions. And if we have time, we'll limit it to individual people. All right. So what are some common problems that you guys have encountered with in-person meetings at NYLAG? Let's start with Rogelio. What are some problems that you've encountered with in-person meetings at NYLAG?
They're the most common now. So I've been doing this for a while now, and I make sure that we have like a buffer period before to understand where we're at. But one of the things that still I experience a lot in the 6 years that I've been here is that attorneys don't recognize that translations takes a lot of mental space, and that we only have a bandwidth about 30 minutes or so, and then we need a break from there. Sometimes these conversations can be very, very sensitive and just emotionally taxing on all parties. And so those are things I still experience, and I think those things just happened just because we have a lot of new attorneys, and so there's a lot of new teachings that we have to do constantly at NYLAG.
Thank you, Rogelio. Denise, same question to you.
I agree with everything that Rogelio said. But I guess for me, it would be more in-person meetings that I've served as an interpreter, would be translating or sight translating, as you mentioned earlier, documents without previous notice. And this could range from client retainers to full affidavits. And as many of you will know, DVLU does handle very sensitive triggering topics. So then to be able to do that without like any pre-notice of what exactly we would be interpreting or translating, that could be a bit taxing emotionally as the interpreter and then also as a person.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, Shelly, I'll repeat the question. What are some common problems you've encountered with in-person meetings?
Yeah, in addition to everything that Rogelio and Denise have said, I will say it's funny, you had mentioned earlier that you tend to find that interpreters find in-person meetings easier than phone calls. For me, I would say it's quite the opposite, simply because I think people are far more relaxed. People can plan for how much time they're usually fitting a phone call into their schedule, whereas for in-person interpretation, the vast majority of the examples where I've been interpreting in person have been in court, usually doing intake. And because that's a pretty hectic, unpredictable pace, a lot of the best practices, I think it's easier for them to kind of go out the window. So like, for example, if we're in a very small space, I can't always position myself perfectly to try to be unobtrusive. And so there will I think, be a lot more potential for side conversations and for people to be looking at me because I can't get out of the way. And I think that honestly, in those situations, attorneys will feel a lot more rushed. And so they may do a lot more, not speaking with pauses because they're kind of frustrated and impatient at how long that's taking. And they may be using a lot of legal jargon because that is like the quickest way to express the concept, but it's ultimately clashing against the fact that interpretation inherently is more time consuming, and you're having to do the double dance of like converting legalese to English and then converting English to language X. So I think that particular situation to me of being in a situation where it's hectic, it's chaotic, it's not fully within everyone's control, that's when it's easy for like best practices to sort of go out the window.
Thank you, Shelley. That's a valuable comment. So I think for Maya, for future trainings and for everybody here in the meeting, it's important to know that setting can really affect the quality of interpretation. All right, great. Did Rogelio or Denise, did you want to add anything about interpreting over the phone or maybe on a video call for your work at NYLAG?
Meaning adding more to, I agree with everything Shirley agreed. It's funny enough, I actually also do say that in True Manhattan, integrating through the phone brings out the best practices, if you will, of attorneys. They have written things down that they want to talk about. They already have they have allotted themselves at least 90 minutes to 2 hours to talk about this, including breaks for us. And it's something that I do appreciate, and that happened a lot once, like 2022, 2023, when we were doing a lot of interpretations through the phone.
Okay, yeah, definitely things have changed now that the pandemic has calmed down quite a bit. All right, I'm going to follow Maya's suggested order here for the rest of these questions. Starting with Rogelio again, what do you wish attorneys and staff at NYLAG knew about working with paralegal interpreters?
I think the most important thing is that our role at NYLAG, it's very unique. We're simultaneously both interpreters and also advocates, and that those roles are constantly reestablished and needs to be talked about with our clients in whatever setting that we need to be in. And I think that as we've grown, specifically in True Manhattan, those boundaries have become clearer, including that to the client. But it takes time. And I think that once we have supervisors involved, directors involved, and all the attorneys involved, and getting to understand that the paralegal role is so dynamic, it really does help out in the translations and interpretations that we have at NYLAG.
Great, thank you. Denise?
So something that I wish attorneys or staff and I like would know about working with paralegals, especially in DVLU. I'm not sure if it's different with other units, but at least with DVLU, paralegals also manage certain cases under them, under the supervision of attorneys. So we do have our own caseload. And so I think it would be appreciated if staff sort of just took into consideration our time, because it's often very easy to search in-house for interpreters without taking into consideration sometimes the fact that they may have their own caseload. And so I think that would be really helpful. And also, guys, as paralegals, it will be really what's the word? I guess it would just be a skill that we need to learn to also know our limitations, because we often think, we try to be the best advocates and we try to provide as many services for our clients in-house, but that could also be a burnout for us. So I think that's just something to keep in mind.
Thank you, Denise. Maria, I see you rejoined us. If you would like to add, we have here just a quick question, which is, What do you wish attorneys and staff at NYLAG knew about working with paralegal interpreters? I'm going to go to Shelley first, so you have time to think about your answer, but I'm going to come back to you. Shelley, go ahead.
Yeah, in addition to everything that Rogelia and Denise said, I guess I will just sort of point out that at NYLAG, second language proficiency is a requirement of most paralegal, job listings, but having interpreter certification is not. So all that to say that you're going to be working with people whose interpretation experience is very varied, and it may not be the case. For example, it may be the case that maybe if you watch some of the examples from the training earlier, you may be like, well, the paralegal that I work with doesn't do XYZ. I mean, first of all, we are also learning about these practices through the course of doing this job. The training that Drew did with us last year was the first time that I had been trained on interpreter practices during my, 4+ years at NYLAG. And so I think some level of patience, obviously there are going to be things that that when we're functioning as interpreters, we need to take, control of, like the flow of the conversation, but things like the practices that we described earlier, like, not using too much jargon or idioms or slang, and making sure to pause and just being aware of our time and not going on for too long. I think those types of things will help bring out the best in us, as well as the patience of, like, if it seems like something isn't going great, I know that there's a tendency, there's a lot of frustration that we have, for example, around the language line service that we use, where it's easy to, and I understand that, I think it's also easy to feel that when you're working sometimes with even a paralegal interpreter, of like, are they really saying what I mean for them to say? I don't think they're doing a good job, what have you. But I think it's important to realize that you're working with people with very varied experience. And so some level of sort of patience and working through it is kind of necessary.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shelley. Maya, did you have a comment?
I just want to echo what Shelley was saying. As I'm listening to all of you, we will go to you, Maria, but I just wanted to say again, all of your jobs are so complicated, and you're talking with people about complicated legal concepts and clients who have gone through, are going through trauma. So just thinking about the level of challenge that you already have in building a connection, a rapport, which we actually want the client to have. What's complicated here is we want the client to have the rapport with the attorney and the paralegal. So it's really complicated. And then there's a language barrier. So I just want everybody to give yourself grace at how challenging all of this is under time pressure. So just want to say all of this is really challenging. So I'm glad that we have these best practices, but also just acknowledge this is just very hard to do.
Absolutely. All right, Maria?
Yes, yeah, for me, I understand that the most important part is that the attorney is the leader of the meeting. So they lead the meeting. It will help the interpreter to smooth, the role, like lead the client, also the interpreter, and set boundary if they are, speaking, confused, or not taking the pause required for them to be able to interpret both sides. I think the attorney leading the meeting is very important from the beginning, and explaining the role with the client as soon they start. So he's the interpreter. This person he'll be, conducting interpretation only. And yeah, because sometimes clients understand that we will be providing legal advice or explaining concepts and topics to them, that this is not the role in the meeting. It's very important that they hear this from the attorney, and pause regularly, direct speech with to the client, and be patient and flexible with us as a paralegal interpreting both sides. I think this we have this already, but still, like my experience is we get confused with the roles, and also clients get confused sometimes. And it's very important that the attorney set the boundaries and limits as soon as the meeting starts.
Yes.
Yeah.
To reinforce what you just said there, Maria, I think it's a great idea that if attorneys would like to, that you announce to the client at the beginning of any meeting where you have the interpreter that that they know the interpreter, acknowledge that fact, but that they'll only be interpreting here. They're not going to be actively participating in the conversation. So that's a great possible suggestion. Okay, let's go here with our next question. And since we have 4 panel members now, 4 paralegals, I'm going to just direct this to a couple of you at a time. What have you seen attorneys or staff at NYLAG do that you appreciated when you were working as an interpreter? Let's go with Denise. Go ahead.
Okay, so there's a lot of things also, like there are positive outcomes that I really appreciate as a paralegal who's an interpreter, is the fact that sometimes they ask you for your time capacity. Just starting a conversation with what is your capacity for this week. It's really helpful. I think we sometimes have like new staff where this might be like a first job and they're just also getting comfortable and establishing boundaries with their own time. So just an attorney or other staff, just to take that into consideration is really important. Another thing that I've also appreciated is when they do send material in advance, or they give you like an overview of what the meeting is going to be. That way, for example, for me, I just a little bit of what Shelley was saying earlier, last year's training was my first interpreter training ever. So there's sometimes like terminology that I have difficulty being able to explain or interpret properly. So just knowing what's coming could help me prepare by looking up the proper terminology in Spanish that could really just make the interpreter's job easier and just, again, keep track of time. So that would be sort of my end.
To add to what you say, Denise, this is certainly not something that we expect of any of you, but keep in mind that knowledge is power for interpreting as well. And if you knew that you were interpreting for, say, a Mexican client about a certain topic, you might even have the opportunity to do what's called localizing, look up and see that in Mexico, the term they use for a prosecutor is procurador, right? Which is different from another country, which may also speak the same language, but uses a different terminology. So there's more opportunity if we give our paralegal interpreters more advance notice. Okay, let's go to Shelley. Same question, if you don't mind. This is, what have you seen attorneys or staff at NYLAG do that you've appreciated as an interpreter?
Yeah, Denise really covered most of it. I guess one thing that I will say recently is, in a longer interpreting session, an attorney was like, let's take a break affirmatively. And I feel like it's very easy to forget to do that. And so I was like, oh, that was perfect for me too, because I did in fact want to go use the bathroom. So yeah, I appreciate that consciousness of the time and like the effort involved. Because I mean, I'm sure even for like the client probably appreciated taking a break too, right? So that was nice.
Yeah, small but very important, absolutely. Okay, what problems with role confusion, specifically referring to your role as paralegal versus your role of interpreter, have you encountered with clients? Let's go to you, Maria.
Yeah, I think I already covered that part, but yeah, like sometimes I understand that being present and that we have knowledge about the case, they understand that we can provide legal advice or also answer or recommend the answer to the attorney. So sometimes they ask us, oh, do I need to say that? Do I, and we had to redirect them like we are here to interpreter and we are going to translate everything you said to the attorney, properly translate. And yeah, so, and this is the most
It
Yeah,
can be
the
really hard. It can be really hard.
it is hard. It is hard.
Yes.
Yeah, from both sides. And also when attorney asks question that we understand that the client may not understanding because of the language and the terms we want to explain can we communicate this better to the client, but we are not allowed to do that. I understand that part, but it's challenging both sides, from client and sometimes from the attorney as well.
Great. And for people who have not spoken with paralegal interpreters at NYLAG about this, I would venture to say on behalf of everybody here that you've been asked at least once about whether or not this is a good attorney, or whether you can trust them, or whether they can really get you a green or whatever kind of relief they're looking for. I'm just speaking from an immigration point of experience. Yeah, I'm seeing people nod their heads. This is probably more common than most attorneys and staff would realize. It's quite common to have them attempt to get you in a side conversation. All right, so next question. In your opinion, how can attorneys make problem solving easier for you as an interpreter? Let's go to Rogelio.
Understanding our boundaries. I think that in my experience, having sessions before we're supposed to interpret and remind them what I can do and how this can look like, has helped ease a lot of the anxieties that might come up with both a newer attorney, an established attorney, or even an attorney who's just burdened with so much other work. And even myself. I'm just rereading the question again. Yeah, just making sure that understanding that our roles do change as advocates once we're interpreting, right? And definitely I've been in positions where I've done a lot of advocacy for a client, and then I have a relationship as an advocate. But when we do need to interpret about something more serious, I need to remind the attorney that it will be nice for them to also remind the client that that relationship has changed in that scenario that we're at, right? Just reminding, I guess, our own boundaries as interpreters and translators in that situation is really, really helpful. Because sometimes our clients do take it personally,
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Shelley, it might be your turn. Go ahead. I can repeat the question if you'd like.
Yes, can you repeat the question?
Yes, of course. In your opinion, how can attorneys make problem solving easier for you as an interpreter?
Yeah, I think just remembering that key point, that the distinction that you brought up earlier, where it's like managing the flow of the conversation is up to the interpreter, but managing the content of the conversation, like the interaction, right? Like if you think about it, and I understand it's so easy to fall into this, I think that if the attorneys that I've worked with have fallen into like this, I don't know, trap, what have you, of putting more responsibility on me in the interaction, I know that it's largely because like they trust me to be able to do that. And so to them, it's an expression of trust and respect for my role as a paralegal, that they're like, well, I know that you got this. Like, I know you can explain this, like, you know, this topic better than me. And sometimes that may even be true. But I think that, to as much as possible for them to take charge of, trying to catch, like, if the client is confused, understanding that because we're trying our best to just communicate what the client is saying, we're not really supposed to be in there manipulating the conversation to try to facilitate the conversation so much that we get rid of the confusion, right? Because we're there to be transparently a conduit for the conversation. And if there is confusion, that may be confusion that's not necessarily happening because of the interpretation, but because the attorney needs to find a different way to phrase something, or needs to find a better way to sort of take control of the situation. So that's probably what I would add there.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, and I think it might be Rogelio next. Rogelio, how can attorneys and staff plan ahead when a conversation might take longer than anticipated?
if it's in person, definitely booking spaces when there's enough time. I've definitely been in positions where conversations go longer and we have to move around, and it really does change the atmosphere and the just general vibe of things. Other is that, again, have a session beforehand. Strategize both with the attorney and the paralegal of where everything's at, and figure out when to have breaks, especially if the conversation is going to be much longer than anticipated.
Great. Maya?
Yeah, one thing you guys said when we were talking to plan for this training is that attorneys need to be planning that things will take twice the amount. Drew, is that generally like the common, or is it even more than that? I don't know.
So I would say if you are just trying to get a baseline, twice is great. Sometimes it can take less, sometimes it might take more. It depends on the particular attorney and client. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that was on because this is recorded and we're gonna have a lot of people watching this recording. So I did want to make sure that, especially for new attorneys, they should be anticipating twice the amount of time for, when you're using an interpreter.
Yeah, thank you. Maria?
Yes, I think that communicating with us, basis of the case, also any special consideration for the client that will, help us mitigate any risk of running over time. Also having document prepared before the meeting. Yeah, this will help, like just to limit the interaction. And also speaking in first person, we reduce the words that we use. And yeah, it just planning, planning the meeting with less time consuming, like preparing beforehand.
Great, thank you. Shelley, I see your hands raised.
Yeah, one thing that I just wanted to add, if you know that the paralegal only has a certain amount of time, the paralegal cannot stay longer than that, but the interaction takes longer and you have no choice, you have to do it, then we have access to a language line, right? And in situations where a paralegal is not around to interpret, people frequently use the language line. Now, because obviously there are, potential challenges that come with working with the language line as opposed to working with us as paralegal interpreters. So my suggestion would be, if at all possible, to try to plan so that everything that like, oh no, it would be really helpful for the paralegal specifically to be interpreting, putting that at the beginning of your time, at the beginning of your interaction, with the acknowledgement that if you run over time, it will be okay to have, in this case, Geneva working on the latter part of it. Because I know some people feel strongly about, Geneva versus Paris. If that's you, then like managing how to use your time to make the most out of the paralegal's time while you have them is key.
Fantastic. All right, Maria? Oh, if you still had your hand up, that's fine. Okay, great. So one last question, and then we're going to turn this around to anybody who would like to ask questions of the panel. And this is, how often do you need a break as an interpreter? Let's start with Rogelio.
Usually about 30 minutes in to a conversation. That's a really good, I hold that like dear to myself, because that's usually when I'm pretty spent already and then I need a break after that.
It's surprisingly tiring. Before I started interpreting in law school, I did not realize how tiring it was. Denise?
I think again, it's just more of, I guess for me, it's just a little bit more tiring when I have to interpret for more heavier topic situations. I think when it comes to interpreting a certain incident that may have caused trauma to a client, that's sort of when I often find myself asking or yeah, sort of asking for more breaks in between the conversation. But usually, other than that, I really let the attorney decide when it's time for that. And then I would also ask for breaks if I do in fact, need to search up a term after asking the client, not after asking the client, after asking the attorney if they knew the like a shorter version of the terminology. So then those are the couple of examples that I would take a break in between.
Absolutely. Okay. And quickly, Shelley, how often would you say that you need a break when you're interpreting?
Usually at around the 40-minute mark is when I start feeling tired. I feel like the max that in like situations where there's really no way to get around it, the max amount of time that I would like to be interpreting is an hour, because unfortunately that's really not been unlikely for me. But honestly, with Roheli, I am completely with setting 30 minutes as a standard, because those hour-long sessions, I feel spent for the day after the.
Yeah, 30 minutes to an hour is a good benchmark, I think. Maria, what would you like to add, if anything?
Yeah, I understand. I agree with Denise. It depends on the matter and the client, and also if we are conducting interpretation over the phone or in person. It can vary. But yeah, I think is depend on the complexity of the case and nature of the case and the way we are conducting interpretation in person or virtually. But I think 30 minutes is fair in person and 45 minutes is fair over the phone for me.
Okay. And
yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Maria. And then just by show of, shaking or nodding of heads, do people feel okay with just a few minutes, like a 5-minute break? Is that enough to be able to get your brain juices flowing again? Okay, great. All right. So now to everybody here, what questions, if any, do we have for our panel members?
Or if any of us also interpret here, if you want to make any additional comments that haven't been made.
Of course. Yeah. Abid?
Thank you guys for doing this, but yeah, you guys said something about getting like an affidavit translated. So would it be a better practice to maybe put like the affidavit in a translator and then have the paralegal check if that translation makes sense and then provide that to the client, or would it just be better for us to have you help us translate the affidavit?
Can I jump in on this one, Maya, if you don't mind, before the panel takes it? So machine translations for affidavits, Abid, can really vary a lot in quality. If you're using Google Translate or one of the other common ones, they get better every year. And I'm a tech optimist. I definitely believe that one day machines are going to replace all of us. But in the meanwhile, it can actually make the problem worse when the language seems garbled. So I'm going to leave it to the panel to say it particular, but I would just caution you before I turn it over to the panel about that practice. Shelley, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not anti-machine translation at all, but what I will say is that like if it makes a wrong assumption about what you mean, and then I'm looking at that, I won't know what you actually meant, right? What the attorney actually meant. And so even though site translation is like, it can be inherently difficult because the language is more complex, what have you, I just think that I would rather solve that issue another way. Like ideally, I tell attorneys, if you can even give it to me like a minute, 5 minutes in advance, even that is enough to help me. Yeah, so I would probably take that over being given a machine translated affidavit.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in with a comment on this?
Sorry. I would like to say that I do agree with machine translation could be a bit weird. I've seen it for myself. Sometimes they will misuse pronouns for the clients, and that's a huge issue when I'm speaking or I'm interpreting the document to the client. So because it does make, I guess, the job easier to read it to the client or let the client read off the document that has been translated to their language. But again, there could be errors. So just going off from what Shelley said, I think to prevent any mistakes in our interpretation for the client, I think it might just be helpful if you could share the affidavit, the documents beforehand, and that way we could review them just to make sure that we have the correct information and we're providing the proper interpretation to the client.
Great. All right, Rohini, go ahead.
I can add a little bit to that. That's how I usually handle those situations. I personally I cannot do any translations off the bat if not I give them documents. And I think just because I've been here for a while, I feel like I have the confidence to do that and say those things. But when I do have those affidavits, we strategize 30 minutes before. I definitely seen attorneys who are still working on the affidavits, right, while we're translating, and that is fine. But at least I want to have maybe 85% of it ready and also maybe printed, so I can have and use and show to the client, right? And that can just be site translations, but also have the attorney be aware that those things are going to probably take like maybe 90 minutes. They take a while, so having that awareness is very, very key to get these things done in my experience.
Thank you. Just so that you, Abid, and everybody else is aware, generally the rule of practice for interpreters is to site translate documents up to a couple pages and up to, say, a medium level of complexity. And I know that's arbitrary, but I can't give you anything more specific. Beyond a few pages and beyond, say, affidavit level of complexity, in other words, something that could plausibly be a client's own language, it's generally not recommended to do site translation. Now, if you were to use, and I don't want to step on any NYLAG policies here, but if you were to use the paralegal interpreters as a translator, I think that often a good way to help a translator work faster is to start with the machine translation and work backwards from there. But that depends again on the quality of the machine, and it depends on the type of document. Okay, great. Any other questions from our group for the panel?
We're at the end of our time, so maybe just
Okay.
one question.
Yeah, one last question if anybody has one.
Or comment.
Well, sounds like we covered the material.
Drew, do you want to say any last thing, and then I'll sign us off?
Sure. Well, it was a very kind of calm, easygoing class, and I appreciated everybody that was here, both members of NYLAG as well as our interpreter paralegals. If I could have people take away just a few things from this, I would say that, first of all, having first-person speech, direct speech towards the client is extremely important. Please avoid saying, tell her or ask him kind of things. Second, do be aware that you are responsible for the content of the conversation, but you should let the interpreter take control of the flow. And then the last thing that I would say is that our interpreter paralegals here at NYLAG are working very hard and learning a lot.
Thanks so much. And I want to thank all of you. Thank you so much, Drew. I think this was an extremely valuable training. Big thank you to our paralegal experts here, Rogelio, Shelley, Denise, and Maria. We had a nice turnout, but I really want to, this is a recorded training, and I'm going to ask all of the directors to seriously consider having everybody watch this training, especially our newer attorneys, because this is such valuable information for working with our limited English proficiency clients, which I know is a large portion of the folks that we work with. So this is really critical to the work we do. Thank you so much, all of you.
Okay.
All right, saying goodbye. For those of you who are trainers, if you can just stay on for 1 second.
Mm-hmm.